shelf over the card table and two folding chairs that served as dining nook came a high-pitched whistle followed by a voice. "We interrupt this program to issue a severe winter storm alert. All city facilities are closed and everyone who is not emergency and essential personnel is requested to stay indoors. Goldport Police Department is on cold reporting. Should your home become unsafe or should you believe that it will become unsafe, these are the public shelters available." There followed a long list of public buildings and churches. Kyrie thought briefly that with the weather the police couldn't be on anything but cold reporting. Icy, in fact, though she knew very well they meant that any accidents should be reported later. Cold seemed such an apt adjective for what was happening outside. Not that she anticipated needing shelter. The little Victorian cottage had been here for over 100 years and presumably had survived massive snowstorms. But though it was only 3 p.m., with the scant light outside, the swirling darkness looked more like stormy midnight than the middle of the afternoon. It was her first blizzard in Goldport, Colorado. She'd lived here for just over a year, but the last winter had been mild, sparing her one of the legendary Rocky Mountain blizzards, which she wouldn't have minded so much, except for the fact that those blizzards grew ever larger in the tall tales of all her neighbors, acquaintances, and the regular diners at the George. For the last week, while the weathermen screamed "incoming," the clientele at the George had been evenly divided between those who'd say not a flake would fall and those who insisted they would all be buried in snow and ice and future generations would find them like so many Siberian mammoths buried in permafrost, the remains of their last souvlaki meal still in their stomachs. Kyrie suppressed a shudder, gave a forceful stir to the bowl of cookie dough she held against her jean-clad hip, and told herself she was being very silly. It wasn't like her to have this sort of fanciful, almost superstitious fear. She'd like to think she had imagination enough, but she'd never had time to let it run riot. She had been abandoned as a newborn at the door of a church in Charlotte, North Carolina, on Christmas Eve, and had lived in a succession of foster homes, having to fend for herself more often than not. She'd grown up slim and graceful, with the muscular body of a runner. At almost 22, she'd been an adult and on her own for about 4 years. She rarely stayed at a job for very long. What she had thought for many years were dreams of turning into a panther and now knew was true shape-shifting usually scared her away from any given place, job, or relationship and had kept her moving before anyone became too close. She'd been afraid of being made to see a psychiatrist. She'd been afraid of being given antipsychotic drugs. Sane or not, she wanted to know her thoughts came from her own mind, not from some chemical. And her madness, as she thought it, hurt no one. It was just dreams. For years, she told herself she didn't miss people or relationships or those other things that seemed to be a given right of all other humans. She kept her own house and her own mind. And until 3 months ago, when Tom had become her boyfriend and started subletting the enclosed porch at the back of the house, she'd been lonely. Very lonely. Then suddenly she'd had to believe she was a shifter, that the panther she dreamed of being was her other self, and that there were others like her. This had tossed her head first into a sea of new relationships, new ties. This house and Tom were the closest thing she'd ever had to a family. Probably the closest thing he'd ever had to a family, too. Oh, he'd grown up with wealthy parents, she knew. He'd been raised in New York City by professional, well-to-do mom and dad, but that hadn't made them a family. It wasn't just that Tom's parents had divorced when he was very young. People might divorce and yet raise their children well and as a family. It was more that his mother had never cared again if Tom lived or died, and his father had left Tom to be raised by hired help and only took notice of him when Tom got in some scrape and had to be bailed out, which he did regularly, possibly because it was the only time he got attention. And then, when Tom was 16, his father...